This episode of The Rookie Hunter is sponsored by North Arm Knives. North Arm Knives are handcrafted and sold directly through a father and son team right here in British Columbia. Choose from a selection of outdoor knives, kitchen knives, and the brand new folding knife from northarmknives.com. They ship internationally and guarantee all their work. Callie and I use their products and give them our stamp of approval. Go to northarmknives.com. Hey guys, welcome to episode 37 of The Rookie Hunter. Today on the show, we're very excited and honored to have Shane Mahoney on. Shane, if you don't know, is the president and CEO of Conservation Visions. His website is conservationvisions.com. He also has a great podcast out there called Conservation Matters. Make sure you check that one out and subscribe to it. Shane wears a ton of hats, actually, and he's going to give us a better and broader description of all the many things that he does for conservation. So again, very excited and honored to have him on the show today. Before we get into it, let's get some of the usual stuff out of the way. You can check out our website. It's therookihunter.com. We've got all kinds of stuff up there, including our contact form, and we welcome emails anytime. There's also links to our social media. All that good stuff is up there. For those of you who want to contribute to the show, we do have a donate button there. And if you want to kick in a few bucks, that certainly helps us out. But if you can't, no problem. There are other things you can do that won't cost you money, and they're easy. All you have to do is go to iTunes or to your favorite podcast app and leave us a rating or review. Let's keep this intro nice and short and get into this conversation. Make sure you stick it out all the way to the end because Shane shares a pretty amazing story about witnessing some rutting caribou. I won't say much more than that. So sit back, relax, crack a cold beer, and enjoy episode 37 with Mr. Shane Mahoney. Kelly Molnar.
How's it going?
Good, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Good. Adjusting the running shoes.
Yeah. Let's get oh, my soul is all messed up.
Gotta be comfortable, man. Do what you gotta do.
Oh, there we go.
So, pretty nice out there. Spring's finally rolling in. We've had some torrential downpours and some flooding going on, but other than that, as long as your house isn't the one being flooded, it's been beautiful.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be close to Mission Creek or any of the creeks.
Yeah, Mill Creek, I
Yep.
think was causing the most problems.
Yeah. The benefits of living on the hills.
Yeah, exactly. And all part of springtime, I guess. I guess the last episode we did was with Jesse Zeman, I guess, eh?
Yep.
So we have two sort of conservation-themed episodes back-to-back, which is kind of cool. And I think conservation is probably going to become more of a focal point for you and I as we seem to learn more about it. I don't know. I think we were pretty blind to the state of things in British Columbia and around the world prior to becoming hunters. I don't know if you'd agree.
Yeah, I think so. I think we touched on that folks in BC think they take it for granted because you look out your window and it's a beautiful place. But you don't really see those animals walking around, right? And you don't realize that there should be more of certain kinds and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Until you're out there and you're seeing it for yourself, or if you're talking to these people, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think what our goal is, and probably what we'll talk with Shane about, is like some of the barriers that we have to remove between, hunters and outdoor enthusiasts and stuff like that, and making this an issue that everybody wants to get behind. So we've been throwing some ideas around about how to do that, and I think we'll get there at some point. But it's important. I don't think the vast majority understands that they own the public land here, or crown land, however you want to call it, and we also all own our wildlife as well. It's everyone's responsibility to kind of get involved and protect these things. So
yeah, they rely on us, right? All the animals are impacted by the decisions we make as a species. So
Yeah.
we have to make the right decisions for them. I think everybody is trying to do that. It's just that some folks get heated over certain issues, but I think we got to bring everybody together somehow.
Yeah, I think it's just spreading science-backed information. And for those of you that are interested, we were actually on Beyond the Kill, which is another great hunting podcast. And that was another subject we kind of talked about in detail again, and that was one on one of our earlier episodes too.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're interested, check out that podcast with Adam Yankee. That's how you say his last name, right?
Yeah.
Nice. We had a good chat with him. I think it was a couple hours long or something like that. So we covered a lot of stuff and had some fun with him.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
So,
fun.
yeah, for anybody who's interested, definitely go
Mm-hmm.
give that a listen and subscribe to his podcast. While we're waiting here, we're going to be talking to Shane Mahoney in a moment here. He has a podcast called Conservation Matters, and they're generally under 30 minutes. A lot of them are only like around the 12-minute mark. They're sort of just like keynote speeches and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd recommend subscribing to that one because he covers a lot of important information, a lot of stuff that we're going to get into here today, I'm sure. So anybody who gets something out of this, make sure and subscribe to his podcast and leave a rating review, because I think it's a very important podcast for
Mm-hmm.
not only hunters, but everyone to be checking out. He just does a good job of explaining things, and he's a great storyteller, and
Mm-hmm.
he's got a great voice. He's just entertaining to listen to. So
Yeah.
speaks with a ton of passion. So I'm excited. And for the first time in a while, I'm a little bit nervous about this interview because I feel like he's sort of a rock star in the
Mm-hmm.
conservation world. So
No, I'm looking forward to it.
should be fun. So we've got a list of things we want to get into here with him, but I don't know. I'm not too sure where this conversation is going to go.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So what else have you been up to?
that's a good question. What have
did
you been
it.
up to?
Uh,
We got a bear hunt planned for this weekend.
yeah. I'm looking forward to that. That
Yeah.
should be cool. I hope the weather, I think it's supposed to start raining.
I know I saw
We'll see what happens.
with spring, it's like every time you check the forecast, it seems to change a little bit. But
Yeah. I went out fishing a couple times. Caught a bunch of kokanee on the weekend. Weather was perfect. Posted a couple pictures. I don't know. I like going out there for kokanee. They're not the biggest fish, but they
It's
put
fun,
up a
man.
fight and they taste great.
they're tasty, yeah,
And they're good looking fish too.
for sure.
Silver bullet. I was also at the shoe swap a while back. I posted a photo of
Oh,
that
right,
too.
yeah,
I caught
nice.
a big, like 9-pound rainbow on the 6-weight fly rod.
The beauty.
Yeah, I was going crazy there. That was fun.
You guys fried that up that night?
Half of it, I still have the other fillet in the fridge.
Nice.
And it's big, man. Like, I don't know how much that would cost in a grocery store. $30
I don't know.
or
Fish is
something.
expensive, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. We should mention too that we've posted a few photos of it. North Arm Knives made us these sweet fillet knives, and they put our logo right onto the blade and stuff like that.
Mhm.
They're awesome.
Yeah, super
And you,
sharp.
I guess you got to try yours out. I haven't used mine yet.
Yeah, I have some fish from my dad's offshore fishing trip
Yeah.
last year. So I had some lingcod, and the skin, the skin was still on the one side. So I
Yeah.
used that knife to just hack that off there, and it took it off without any meat waste.
Nice.
And then I used it for the kokanee. I haven't filleted them or anything, but just the usual,
Just cleaning them.
cleaning them and prepping them and then throwing them in the freezer. I'm going to smoke them, so I don't like to
Nice.
do too much with them until then. But
Yep. Beautiful.
yeah, no, it's just sharp knife. It looks great.
Yeah. Looks awesome.
Yeah.
I like just pulling both of them out of the drawer and just looking at them.
I mean, I used to use those, those ones you get at Canadian Tire, just the wooden handle with the blade it doesn't go right through the handle. It's just kind of
Inserted into
inserted in
yeah.
there. And then it comes with that leather sheath thing. I just use those all the time, or just a hunting knife. Like
Yeah.
I was using the lynx there for a while.
Right.
But this is just perfect
Yeah.
for that kind
Definitely.
of
Well, Kelly, before we give Shane a call, I don't see him online yet. We should probably take care of some important business here. What is on tap?
This is called the Ode to Wallflower Pale Ale, gin barrel aged.
It's good.
Yeah,
This is up there in the top 5, I think, man.
Yeah, it's by Powell Brewery in Vancouver, and it's a collaboration with Odd Society, makers of fine spirits. So what they do is they threw the beer in old gin oak barrels.
Yeah, you can taste a little bit of the gin in there.
Yeah, just barely. It's pretty good.
Cool. Well, here we go.
Hello.
Hello, Shane. It's Mike and Kelly here.
How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Good, thanks.
So, Shane, if you don't mind, I think a lot of our listeners are going to know who you are. But for those who don't, if you don't mind giving us an introduction about who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Shane Mahoney. I'm a research biologist by training and profession. I ran all of the wildlife research programs in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador for many years, focusing my own personal interest mostly on big mammal studies and predator-prey interactions involving bears and lynx and wolves and so forth, with caribou and moose most specifically. But I then shifted from that to some extent to run the sustainable development and science programs for the government. Founded a research institute here at the university, partnership between the government and the university. And along the way became very much involved in speaking about and promoting the ideas of why conservation matters and why wildlife, the wild others who share this planet with us, matter so much. And that gradually evolved into a television and radio and print media engagements and career, I suppose, to some extent. I currently run my own organization called Conservation Visions. I serve as Vice Global Chair for Sustainable Use for the UN affiliate, the World Conservation Union. I am Vice President of the Policy and Law Division for the International Council for the Conservation of Wildlife, International Liaison for the Wildlife Society, and I'm now the Executive Director for the High Lonesome Institute in Colorado, which is a big private lands-based institute. I give policy advice to governments, to wildlife agencies, obviously, and I still participate significantly in innovative research using unmanned vehicles or drones for wildlife-related studies, building and interrogating big databases on conservation, and of course have a fairly active social media presence now with a lot of specialists helping me with that. So that's kind of what I do.
Excellent. Yeah, you wear a lot of hats, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Shane, do you know much about Kelly and I and how this podcast all kind of came together? Or?
Not really, I have to be honest. I mean,
No, that's fine. So
read just a little bit that's available.
Yeah, so the name of the podcast is The Rookie Hunter. Kelly and I are both 32, and we just started hunting at 29 years old. So this is all fairly new to us, and that's the reason why we figured this was a great opportunity to chat with you, because before we got into the sport, we were under the impression that things in British Columbia were managed well, and the wildlife populations and fish numbers were all in good shape. And as we've gotten into hunting, you start to realize that these things aren't as good as you thought you were. You become more invested in the whole culture of everything. So it's kind of been an interesting journey for us, and through doing this podcast over the last year and a bit now, we're hearing from lots of new hunters, and they're not all just young guys. We hear from anywhere from early 20s up into late 50s, guys who are just getting into the sport. So this is a great opportunity for you to kind of pass on some information to the next generation of hunters. So very honored to have you on the podcast for sure.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the explanation. There's a lot of journeys in life, and the journey to engaging in the harvest of wild creatures for legitimate purpose is one that frankly can start at almost any age. Some people begin, of course, in the sort of traditional narrative as very small children accompanying a father or an uncle or some family member engaged in the activity and learn sort of almost organically. But there are a lot of people who come to this activity who did not have that experience or background. And in fact, it is highly likely that as we move forward in time, a majority of hunters will not come from that kind of long-term, from childhood experiential kind of journey, but will in fact come to the activity with a much more mature, thoughtful, logical decision-making trajectory. And this, to some extent, exposes the deep and continuing relevance and resonance of hunting, that it is far from something that is passé or sort of calcified, and rather it is something that remains vibrant and open and something worthy of exploration by people in very modern circumstances, in very modern countries, in very modern contexts.
Yeah, I think that, Mike and I started, at this point, I think we kind of have an idea of both sides of the fence. We grew up in the Kootenays, and there's a lot of hunters there. So we were familiar with it, but we never really dove in. And then there were some circumstances happening. Mike's dad had passed away, and he was a big outdoorsman. And that kind of was one of the main events that, pushed us into exploring, why he did that and connecting that way. But also the connection to our food was really important. We started paying attention to Steve Vernella and all those kind of guys. So everything kind of came together in the sense of starting a new hobby and a new activity anyways. And then from there, I think it didn't take long before we realized how serious it actually was all around as an activity. But like Mike said, also just the fact that we thought in BC animals were, we thought everything was okay. And as you get into this and you start talking to the right people, you realize that there's a big demand for science right now and funding and all that kind of stuff, and across borders. And you look at Idaho and some other states, and it's a bit of a different picture.
Well, it can be a bit of a different picture, but if one takes an even wider view than that, globally, we are in a race against time to save an enormous range of life forms, every one of them unique and every one of them as important as another, in truth. And so contained in that mix, there are some very iconic species that we see disappearing, and there are many, many, many unknown species or unfamiliar species to most people that are also disappearing. So while a circumstance in British Columbia may be such and such, and a circumstance in Idaho or Nevada or Newfoundland or wherever may be such and such. I mean, if we look at it from a world and global perspective, which is, I think, what we have to do, then we realize we are all, hunters and non-hunters alike, faced with an extraordinary wave of loss, depletion, and extinction of life forms every bit as interesting as our own, and every bit as unique. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it is only us who are able to make the decisions on their behalf.
On a global scale, Shane, are there examples you can point out of things that are sort of positive change, things that are being done correctly, and on the alternatively, things that need a lot of improvement? I'm sure there's a ton of examples of that, but are there a few that you can sort of pull out?
Yeah, I mean there are many positive examples in the world where wildlife species that we have focused upon, of course, or wildlife habitats that we have focused upon have fared very well. I mean, perhaps one of the best examples is to look at wildlife in North America generally, and then to focus on harvested species, traditionally harvested species within the North American context. We're talking the waterfowl and the ungulates, the deer, the elk, the moose, these kinds of species, and numerous others. And we can demonstrate that for many of them, in much of their range, their numbers are incredibly healthy, and in some cases, some people would argue almost superabundant in the case of certain species of waterfowl like Canada geese or certain other species like white-tailed deer. So, and those species have, of course, been subject to both, protectionist policies such as the establishment of refuges and national parks, but have also been subject, obviously, to continuing and regulated legal harvest for a very long period of time. So there are, that's an amazing example at a large scale. But of course, that has required a great deal of investment and institution building in both Canada and the United States to make that work. We have seen, obviously, numbers of species that have been listed, both here and in other parts of the world, on Endangered Species Acts and legislations, which have been recovered. Peregrine falcons, even bald eagles in the United States, although in a place like British Columbia or Newfoundland, they're very common. Mm-hmm. I mean, they were listed and recovered from the list, and we've seen lots of examples of that. We've seen great recoveries in many of the great whale species, the big whales, and also some smaller ones, but certainly many of the big whales that attracted our attention. We've seen really significant recoveries in populations of humpbacks, and even in the bowheads and right whales now we're seeing this kind of return. We have lots of examples worldwide where we have recovered things. Black and white rhinoceros are another example. But, generally speaking, these are the select few that, we have as a species ourselves, as humans, that we have focused upon. Not all of them are charismatic species such as I have described, and not all of them are subject to harvest. Obviously, we've invested enormously in populations of certain marine turtles and so on to help those populations recover or to stabilize them as best we can. There's a tremendous capacity in the human being and in human societies to do the right things. But on the other hand, the overall trend in the abundance and diversity of wildlife across many layers, from vertebrates, all the way down to the lower life forms. There are just such a cascade, a typhoon of extinctions occurring and depletions around the planet that we have to realize that as good as we are and as good as we might do, we have a long way to go to bring some sense of congruency and balance, which is a poor word, but you know what I mean, in terms of our demands on the planet and the needs of wild creatures everywhere.
Maybe we are talking to a lot of rookies out there, and folks that are just thinking about getting into hunting or fishing. I'm wondering if you can give us a background just on conservation in North America and kind of how that compares to the rest of the world, because I think I've listened to a couple of your podcasts, and the conservation system that was created by Roosevelt and all those types is really one of the greatest accomplishments that we've had. So, and I don't know if a lot of folks really understand that.
No, a lot of people don't. And of course, in the world today, hunting has become a very controversial issue, and certain types of hunting more controversial again. And, a great many people, very well motivated, very sincere, and, very capable and balanced, simply find it difficult to come to terms with the idea of killing wild creatures under any circumstance. They are not aware of the history of sustainable harvests and how they can be part of incentivizing large groups in society, whether it's indigenous peoples or non-indigenous peoples, to develop a great commitment to wildlife on the one hand, and in other cases to become incredibly tolerant of some wildlife species that can be challenging for human beings to live with, whether they're large carnivores or whether they are marauding elephants in the African context or things of that nature. In North America, in the turn of the 20th century, had Canada and the United States possessed endangered species legislations at the time, we would have listed as endangered most of the more iconic, well-known species of large animals that we are all familiar with, such as white-tailed deer and mule deer and elk and black bear and grizzly bears and waterfowl and so forth, wild turkey. I mean, many species that are even super abundant today. We have turkeys in our driveways. We have white-tailed deer on our lawns and in our parks and in our golf courses or whatever. We have, we have Canada geese everywhere. We have snow geese in super abundance. I mean, even those species, many of them would have actually been listed as endangered because wildlife had been so depleted across vast tracts of North America. And it wasn't just those big species. Animals like beavers, for example, as a result of unfettered exploitation, were almost extinct east of the Rocky Mountains, which is hardly entertainable intellectually, cognitively, consciously by most people today. But this is the truth. And the movement to safeguard that and to resurrect that assemblage of wildlife continentally was a task almost beyond comprehension. And yet history is clear. There is no doubt about this, and the evidence is empirical for anyone who wishes to explore it, that it was primarily, fundamentally, most aggressively, most forcibly, the people who were interested in the harvest of wildlife and in the engagement in the outdoors that involved hunting and angling, who spearheaded most of the institutions, most of the legislation, most of the policies that eventually enabled wildlife to recover, and which today sees us with the abundance of wildlife we have across this continent, and the incredible array of institutions, from university programs to government agencies to the enormous array of non-governmental organizations, the Ducks Unlimiteds, the Elk Foundations, et cetera, who work on behalf of wildlife everywhere. And, this did not happen by accident. This is not someone didn't wave a magic wand and all of a sudden all of this happened. The funding, the volunteerism, the political agitation, all of this came out of a deeply held sentiment and love for wild places and for wildlife and for the experience of being with them. So for young hunters who are, interested in becoming involved, or young people who are considering whether they should become involved in today's modern context and climate where there is such, debate over the legitimacy of hunting and its ethical propositions. They should be aware that, they're not joining a legion of indifferent people who harvest things. They are joining the legions of people who cared so much that they played the front and center role in the rescue, recovery, and then the maintenance and management and sustainability of wildlife populations for now over a century in both Canada and the United States. It is also important for those young people who may be considering hunting and who may decide to try hunting or angling or may decide ultimately not to, that it was not just people who hunted and fished who helped drive this. There's no question that was the greatest force. But there were many people always who sought a different path and who were mostly driven to support and call for, recommend and agitate for national parks and protected areas, protected wilderness areas, and in many cases that did not allow hunting or angling even in some cases. So, it's important for young people trying to make this decision that it isn't an either or, that, conservation is a big tent, and anyone who cares for animals, cares for wildlife, can be a part of this. But the idea that, a group, more protectionist, are somehow silly and don't get it, or that, hunters are brutal and engaged in an anachronistic kind of activity that should have long disappeared. There is not much place for those polarizing views. And I think if we were able to interrogate, nature, I guess the greatest concern nature would have at the present time is for its own sustainability, and maybe would venture that we need every effort that is motivated to keep nature with us mobilized at the present time.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, I think the most important thing is that it is very much a team effort, whether you're a hunter or a non-hunter. So how do you think we go about removing barriers between groups, if that's possible?
Well, I think it's possible. I mean, it always amazes me that, conversations often start with the proposition that it is not. So I go into groups, and I have certainly spoken before non-hunting communities and audiences. I've spoken even in audiences where significant numbers of people were opposed to hunting. And obviously I've spoken to audiences that have hunting and hunters amongst them. I think the first and most important step is to stop using derogatory terms to refer to people who hold different views, and also for everybody to take a little bit of time and effort and invest in an understanding of the history of conservation. Mm-hmm. Just because somebody hunts or fishes does not make them a conservationist, and just because somebody who's able to say the word national parks doesn't make them a conservationist either. This is a very complicated business, an intersection of economics and politics and social policy and evolving social norms and traditions and baselines, and often involves international context for migratory species. This is not something that one becomes, like Saul on the road to Damascus because a thunderbolt or a bolt of lightning knocks you off your ass. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a piece of business that's very hard to come to terms with and to know what's best to do. And so the very first thing is to seek a little knowledge before we speak, and then to eliminate the ridiculously polarizing terms that we use for one another, whether it's greenies or antis, as hunters and anglers often refer to individuals who don't participate in these activities or may be opposed, or, the Bubba kind of characterization of hunters and anglers by people who are sometimes opposed to hunting. Was Theodore Roosevelt a Bubba? Was this man who came to epitomize America, a man who wrote dozens and dozens of books and who traveled the entire world and had his own little museum as a boy of 5 or 6 years of age, who, straightened out cartels and fought organized crime and did all the other things that man did? Was he not somebody to admire? On the other hand, were there not individuals like John Muir who fundamentally believed in a more protectionist, leave it alone approach to conservation, who, could go for weeks in the wilderness without taking so much as a fishhook on his person and survive by his own knowledge of natural systems, something that 99.999% of all hunters and anglers in the world could not do? Was he somebody that we should look down upon and disparage because he did not really think hunting was something that we should maintain? I mean, these are just ridiculous propositions that people make. Mm-hmm. I mean, they have no place in a progressive, forward-looking society. There's no intellectual basis for them. There's not even any logic for them. It's just another form of racism. Yeah. And I detest it. I detest ideological positions of all kinds. Yeah. And so I think the first step is to simply realize that our history is made up of, our history of wildlife recovery was possible because of inclusiveness. That doesn't mean we all think the same. It just means we can agree on doing things that will benefit a broader objective, just like maintaining peace enables us to do, mm-hmm. and requires us to do.
I think one of the things for effective communication is that, you just need one party to, take responsibility for the effective communication and turn their chair in and be patient. I think that responsibility falls on the hunters in a lot of cases to, not have the knee-jerk reactions and call people names and, just assume that nobody understands this. And I think we kind of have to advocate for ourselves. And in the social media world nowadays, it seems like that's becoming more difficult to do because it's almost a form of, not getting your information first and just saying the first thing that comes to your head. So, it's a difficult thing in our time now is to, like you said, go out, do your research, get some information, and try to do the best you can to actually have a meaningful conversation with someone rather than, just throwing a post up or.
Yeah, I think we found sites like Twitter to be the worst place to have a conversation with somebody who might be on the opposing side of an argument. I think face-to-face is definitely the way to do it. And Kelly and I, as new hunters, and that we do have the opportunity to kind of tell people about how we got into this and why it's important to us. And it's it could be a good half-hour, 1 hour conversation. It's not just a few characters in a tweet. There's no way I think that you can get your point across and back those points up with facts and stuff like that without I just don't think it really gets you anywhere on social media. What do you feel like social media has done both positively and negatively, Shane?
Well, I think first of all, we have come, I think, in the debate over hunting, speaking from the perspective of those who have been often attacked, namely hunters, we have come to a point where we tend to blame the mechanism for all our ills. And that would, to me, be like having blamed newspapers in their day or blamed Alexander Bell for his inventions in his day. Social media is just another form of communication. And had Teddy Roosevelt had it at his disposal, he wouldn't have had to go to all the train stops that he did when he was trying to get elected.
Right.
So, first of all, I put it in that kind of context. It has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. And just like any other kind of medium, it has individuals, consumers, who will consume the easiest, smallest pieces, and then it will have some people who will delve deeper. Overall, the communication potential that we have in the world today is an absolute phenomenon. It is just simply unbelievable that we can translate information and transport information in the way we have. But it also means that we have to recognize our responsibilities in this and recognize the longevity of things. When one writes an article, an op-ed piece for the newspaper, that in its day, and still is to this day, something that's far more permanent than a conversation that was never recorded by any mechanical device. Now we have the net, and we have this world where essentially anything that is digitally produced virtually is kept forever in a sense. And we have to recognize that, all of us, that this is true. And some people learn that very painfully. The other part about social media that I think is highly relevant to this discussion is the instantaneous nature of it and the process of reductionism that's part of it. In other words, these smaller messages in tighter and tighter time sequences. Mm-hmm. And it means that there isn't any opportunity to explain, particularly to strangers whom at one time we would never communicate with, what we really mean by something. So let's take, for example, the infamous photographic posts of many hunters, which incentivize many people in the broad public to respond negatively. Well, at one time, the only people that a hunter might communicate with or show such a photograph to would be family members or friends, not only who would be familiar with the activity, perhaps, or with the individual, and know that he or she was a good person, and therefore that would be the opening interpretation they would make of any communication from them. And then they would show this photograph and be able to explain to them what was really happening and what was behind all of this. But that is not true in the social media world. You lay it out there, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people who obviously have no idea if you're a decent person or not, have no idea if you're progressive or not, have no idea if you're just somebody who wants to kill things or not, instantly makes an interpretation. This is the big difference in social media. This is what has made it very difficult to ever draw back and also at the same time ever be able to impart the full context of things. But knowing that is a reality should inform us as to how we ought to use that medium. And look, there is no one who can tell me that hunter or non-hunter, that there are not some egregious things posted on social media with respect to hunting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care who you are. There are certain things that are outrageous, just as there are lots of other outrageous things posted on social media.
Yeah.
And of course, it is those outrageous things that tend to get the attention.
Mm-hmm.
But we make a lot of mistakes in the communication over hunting and have been doing it for a very long period of time. I just don't blame social media for, for example, the Cecil phenomenon. When the line, I don't blame social media for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at odds with the majority of people I talk to over it because they naturally claim that was the issue. And also, I think with social media, we have to understand that there's many, many outcomes of social media. So, for example, when the Cecil incident broke loose, the vast majority of people in the world had no idea that there was hunting of lions in Africa today.
Mm-hmm.
Also, however, the vast majority of people had no idea about the status of lions, whether they were healthy, whether they were endangered, whether their numbers had plummeted or been reduced. And a component of society became much more knowledgeable about the circumstances facing lions, etc. So at the same time that any community may say, oh, I wish our information had not been interpreted that way, we also have to realize that there are other interpretations going on at the same time that may be beneficial overall. I mean, after all, don't we want as many people on the planet as possible to be concerned about wildlife?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think a great example of use of social media is what happened in the States with public lands. So they had their Keep It Public and public landowner campaign going on. And, while they were fighting to keep those lands public, we saw that stuff on social media like crazy.
Yeah,
and it
up.
made a huge impact, and it got people, it was almost like a grassroots effort, and people were actually getting out and, standing up for the right to keep these lands in their hands. So that's definitely the positive side of things, and I think that's probably the best way to make use of these tools.
Yeah, there's how you present your message, but there is also the issue of what is your message.
Yeah.
The message that public lands belong to the people, that they were part of nation building. It's interesting. I'm just finishing a second article on this for Sports Afield now. That has resonated. It has also been controversial, by the way, but it has resonated since the time that the colonies in America transferred their land to governments. It's a message that resonates with the American people, and obviously it did. And it turned the attitude of governments, at least on a particular bill, in a direction that those of us who love the outdoors and believe in public lands obviously supported. So I think it is a very good example of where, the medium can be turned to great positive use. Again, this, however, is in our opinion. Perhaps if we were talking to people who, I don't know, had great interest in resource extraction, they might say that was a terrible thing that happened.
Yeah, true.
But it's not social media's fault, whether it's terrible or good. It's
Right.
really our interpretation of it, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a good point.
To go along with that theme and another narrative, which to go back to hunting, you've been working on an initiative called the Wild Harvest Initiative, which from our understanding is kind of, how do we change the narrative on hunting and connect with, everybody regardless of what bucket they're in. Can you give us a bit of a background on that and where you're hoping to go?
Sure. The idea is that, first and foremost, we need to give wildlife a greater value in society overall, at every level. The spiritual, the consumptive, the non-consumptive, the artistic, every possible human value that could positively enhance the profile of wildlife in our midst, I am seeking. Because I witnessed for many years, as somebody who worked in government, just how low a priority wildlife often was in land use and ecosystem development decisions. And I want the wild others of this planet to have a stronger voice. And to have a stronger voice, they must have a stronger value. They must have a greater value. And it is really odd in many ways that the original and most enduring value that is associated with the harvest of wild creatures, whether this is commercial fisheries or recreational hunting and angling, the food value, was kind of lost in the emerging modern expose of hunting and angling in Canada and the United States. We were accepting of the idea that the harvest of wild creatures was important for maybe indigenous peoples in various range states in Africa, or certain coastal populations in parts of Asia, or even here in North America or whatever. But the idea that we, as recreational hunters and anglers, the 40 to 50 million people a year who participate in these activities in Canada and the United States, that we collectively were involved in a massive food procurement enterprise was simply lost. And it just suddenly occurred to me that, how can this be when in particular we live in a time where people are becoming ever more concerned about the quality of their food, nutrition generally, their health and well-being, and, the desire to sort of live forever and die of nothing, that's become very prevalent in society. Mm-hmm. And so I started thinking about the harvests that we make. And then I asked myself, has anybody ever attempted to quantify the amount of wild food that is harvested by 40 to 50 million people each year, that is consumed by them, and that is then shared with 4 to 5 or 6 other people as we share our wild harvest with people? And the answer was no. Incredibly, after 100 years and more of a model of conservation and harvest that has been sustainably exercised, we have never, ever attempted to account for the full harvest of these wild creatures. And nor, therefore, have we ever given them that particular value, the value of the meat and fish, the value of the food itself that comes to us. We've evaluated job creation and the amount of money spent on, firearms or things of this nature, but never the value on the animals themselves. This was incredible to me. Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable.
I could be wrong here, but do you think that, the other aspects like job creation and firearms and camo and all these things, they get wrapped up in that marketing, like what can they market, what can they make money off of? But the food was never in that equation because they could just never make money off of it?
Well, I think there certainly is a certain kind of marketing, economic, industrial kind of complex. I mean that term in both ways, that was kind of at play here. But I think also there was a part of this that was simply that hunters and anglers accepted this. Of course, that's what they did. They wanted the food. Of course, I mean that was a given, and so they never thought they'd explain it. It was like trying to explain somebody why your diaphragm goes up and down. Well, it's kind of necessary for life, and so that was part of it. And I think the other part of it was we never thought enough about them. We never thought enough about them. And so anyway, I want to change this. And so I have launched the Wild Harvest Initiative that fortunately is gaining a lot of support from state governments and provincial agencies and NGOs and private citizens across a broad and industry and business. And we are pulling together all of the information on the harvest of fish and wildlife in all 69 jurisdictions, political jurisdictions in Canada and the United States. We are assessing the full numbers of harvests, the full weight or biomass of all of those harvests, from everything from deer to waterfowl to black bear to wild turkey, from bass to brook trout. And we are assessing not only the gross harvest, if you will, the full body weight values of all these animals, but we are looking to come up with a quantification of the net or the consumable biomass. We intend to work with economists to give us a fair market value. If we had to go out and buy brook trout or wild salmon or elk or black bear meat or deer or whatever, what would it actually cost? We're going to build that full total value of what that food is worth. We're going to identify how important it is to local diets. We are going to calculate a sharing index. We believe that somewhere around 200 to 250 million people consume that food in our two countries each year. And then we are going to calculate the replacement costs. So let's say for any reason tomorrow, hunting and angling, recreational hunting and angling disappear in Canada and the United States. How much wild land do we have to take? How much fertilizer do we need to apply? How much loss of species, how much restriction on wildlife movement has to occur for us to, even organically, through free-range agriculture and so on, replace this food? And that is not to disparage agriculture. That is simply to put in a modern context the food harvest value of these wild species that if we protect the land and protect the waters, will be there forever to sustain not only those people who wish to learn how to harvest them humanely and to care for the meat and their bodies in the right way so that we can consume them, but also to all the other people who share in that healthy wild harvest. And in doing so, I hope we will join with the berry pickers and the wild fruit harvesters and the mushroom harvesters and all the other people who attempt to gather from nature these sustainable resources to place hunting in a modern context. And instead of trying to make it seem like something special and, a closed society that only a few can participate in, and that it's a phenomenal thing that what we do, I simply want to make it normal. Make it normal. Make it just a choice of how you will gather the meat and fish that you consume, because one way or another, animals die.
Very true. And the Wild Harvest Initiative really resonates with Kelly and I. A lot of the reasons that you outline are part of why we got into hunting in the first part. And I know you've mentioned before, like a lot of people are interested in the 100-mile diet and moving towards organic food. And so I think, if you're able to lay out all this information for the general public, it's going to really resonate with them. And I think, even gardening, I was always into gardening even before I got into hunting. And the two of them, seem very much connected to me because there's so much pride in the food that I was able to harvest from my garden. And the same is for the meat that I've been able to harvest. And, the part that some people might not see is your ability to share it with friends and family and the number of people that you're able to feed with that meat. And Kelly and I had a successful season, and now we're going on to, 8 or 9 months of not having to purchase meat from any butcher or anything like that. It's all stuff that we've been able to harvest on our own, and it's extremely rewarding. So I think people will really resonate with the Wild Harvest Initiative. I think it's great.
I think they will as well. And just to add to your observations and your own personal journey, it is worthwhile for all of us, both those who are hunters and those who are non-hunters, and I think even people who might listen to the podcast who are really opposed to the activity, to think about this issue of wild food and the relationship with gardening, because it's very true that you will feel inclined not only to appreciate the food that you have grown yourself or acquired yourself through hunting and angling in a way that you will not something that you have bought. But secondly, you will feel, and everyone does, everyone, just this kind of irrepressible tendency or impulse to share this wild food or this food that you have grown. Now, you will not go to the store and buy a head of cabbage and give it to a neighbor, right, but you will certainly give a neighbor carrots that you have grown in your garden. You will not go to the store and buy even the most expensive cut of beef, the best prime rib that you can possibly acquire, and walk up or walk across the road to your neighbor, or even go to your parents' homes or your sister or brother or your friends and say, here's this lovely roast I bought for you at the grocery store, because they think you were nuts. And you'd never think of doing it anyway. Yet suddenly, when you are in possession of deer meat or elk meat or turkey or bear meat or waterfowl, whatever it might, or wild fish, whatever it might be, one of the very first things you're inclined to do, and I don't have to know Mike and Kelly to know that this is true of them, as I know it's true of all of us. You are bound to share that food, not just with your girlfriends or your wives or your family or your children, but with people. It's a phenomenon that occurs. And we have to ask ourselves a very important question. Why? What's the difference? Why does a piece of meat that you have acquired through the profound and often disturbing engagement of having to take or being willing to take the life of an animal by your own hand and harvest that meat, versus walking into a grocery store where the cow no longer looks like a cow, it is simply a piece of meat lying there? Why is it that on the one hand you are compelled to share, and on the other you are not?
Mm-hmm. Shane, you made some good points on a couple other podcasts as well that reflect back to traditions. I think this is one of those traditions, but why do people still light candles in their house, or why do people have a fireplace and do all these things that kind of relate back to thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. I think society's progressed so far in the last 50 years that we kind of lost sight of even 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But that was also one of the things that, for any rookie hunters listening, or Mike and I think there's a connection there that you kind of step back from the veil of like current life and society, and you kind of get a more of an appreciation of where we came from, and not just the animals, but just where we came from.
I think that's absolutely true. And of course, it's, a lot of people have asked me over the years why we hunt. And that's a long, long, long story that usually gets answered by people when they're asked it about the benefits of hunting. In other words, I hunt because I get this, or I hunt because I get that, or I hunt, when actually the motivations are much deeper and much more profound. But at any rate, one of the best ways, I suppose, to encapsulate some of that without going into the detail is that, you become the primitive man. You become the alert man. Alert, I use that term generically, of course, to mean people, but you become intensified in that experience in a way that does not happen in other circumstances. None of your listeners has spent any more time than I have with wild animals. That I can almost certainly guarantee you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have done it as a research biologist, where all I carried was my binoculars and my spotting scope, day after day after day, many, many, many years, on seabird islands, on the caribou barrens, in bear dens, and just constant. I mean, just every season. It's an unbelievable life, but there is a difference even beyond that. Even when you were immersed as an animal behaviorist in pure wilderness, these areas were all areas you had to fly to. No one drove there. You had to fly in and live there. And so you became part of that circumstance, of course. You knew the land and you traveled it and you smelled like it and you lived within it.
Mm-hmm.
But when there is the possibility that you will find, confront, stalk, and eventually kill a wild creature, the level of sensual alertness, not only that comes innately, but which is necessary in many cases to be successful, is at another level. And for those who might listen who have never experienced it, they may think that this is all associated with the moment of killing. And while that is an incredibly profound and intense moment, there are many periods of great intensity. A track, a piece of fur, the smell of the urine or feces of the animal that has just passed, or the indications from the sky above when the ravens or gray jays tell you that something is changing, or when the wind shifts and suddenly you know that everything that you have tried to maneuver for all that day has suddenly been lost because the senses of those creatures that you pursue are 1,000 times better than yours. All of those things are part of this elevation of the experience to one that is unmatched in other circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As you mentioned, Shane, we're in the middle of an election here in BC today. And one of the hot topics running up to the election was the grizzly bear hunt and trophy hunting in British Columbia. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this whole issue, because I think from the general public's perspective, I don't think they fully understand the whole topic. And also the word trophy hunting, I think, is sort of misunderstood and seems to have a few different definitions depending on who you talk to.
Well, it certainly is a lightning rod of a term and a lightning rod of an issue, obviously. And it's not just an intense and controversial issue within the context of British Columbia or grizzly bears, but it is a globally very intense issue. And of course, we ought to realize that the reason it's an intense issue is that it is not a frivolous discussion at all. It is an important discussion. First of all, the original term for trophy hunting, where did this come from? How did this emerge? People believe they've suddenly discovered it, and both on the hunting and non-hunting side, and that it's some kind of modern institution or modern concept. When wildlife was depleted at the turn of the 20th century, which I had referred to earlier, an organization known as the Boone and Crockett Club, founded by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell, that, by the way, eventually led to the founding of the Audubon Society as well, and many other things. They established many policies and agitated for many positive things for wildlife. And one of the things that they did was they organized what was eventually advertised as kind of a collection of heads and horns in the press and other popular outlets of the time, the social media of the time. And as we look back on that, many people assume that sort of beginning of the harvest of wildlife to display and show was sort of identical with what we see today. But the rationale for the Boone and Crockett Club at the time of mounting this display was that they firmly believed that the species they were exhibiting were lost, that the publics of the United States of America would never see them again. And so these heads and horns were displayed as best representatives of their kind, and the people were told, come and see the vanishing wildlife of America, and the subtext really was, before it's all gone.
Wow.
Because they just didn't believe it could be saved.
Right.
They also agitated for what was known as fair chase hunting, which is where market hunting would be outlawed. You couldn't use punt guns and, blast passenger pigeons with dynamite and do all this kind of stuff, but a person had to pursue the animal in a fair chase circumstance. And what eventually got translated was that the people who did that and the animals that they secured would be seen as a real trophy, because what had they done? They had gone out and agreed that they would pursue the animal in a fair chase condition, and they would only harvest mature males of the species so that they would protect the breeding component of the population, which of course was the females and also the younger males. And this is where trophy hunting, in quotation marks, it wasn't called that then, was actually introduced as one of the principal mechanisms for allowing the continued harvest of wildlife, while at the same time allowing wildlife populations to recover, and forms the basis of most wildlife management programs that involved harvest to this very day, where the emphasis is on a harvest by sex and by consideration of age and so on and so forth. Now, over time, this became more and more associated with the idea of the great white hunter, the person who traveled long distances and maybe harvested things in Africa, elephants or rhinos or lions or other things of this nature. And of course, the whole history of all of this became changed and distorted. And of course, hunters themselves played a role in distorting this image. The end result is that for 40 to 50 years in Canada, in the United States, and to a lesser extent, a lesser time period in Canada, if you ask the majority of people, do they support hunting, recreational, legal, fair chase hunting, they say, yes. If you ask them, do you support hunting for food, for meat, they say resoundingly, yes. If you ask them if they support trophy hunting, they say, no, I'm not so keen on supporting trophy hunting. So, number of points. Number one, it began as a pure conservation idea. Number two, it became distorted over time, long before the bad ogre of social media evolved. And number three, what we see today is a reaction to it that is now very much about the word, and even many people who support hunting are challenged when they encounter that term trophy hunting, because what they think is a person simply goes to kill an animal, they simply are interested in doing so and shooting things, and that the animal is not fully used and the animal is wasted, and the only thing that is taken back are the horns or the hide or something of this nature, when in fact the majority of animals that are harvested, whether they are really old males or whatever is harvested by people who travel internationally to hunt, in the vast majority of cases, of course, the meat is used, but they also take back the hides or the horns or some example of that particular hunt. Now, for some people, none of these distinctions will make a difference. But for some people who are really trying to understand what is at stake, they will try to appreciate these facts, and to also remember that in a number of range states in Africa, countries in Africa, where, in quotation marks, trophy hunting exists and has been a tradition for a long period of time, the hunting concessions that cater to international hunters, who obviously are not going to travel from Europe or the United States and bring back all the meat of the animals they harvest, those international hunters who hunt there, and the financial returns enable large pieces of land in parts of Africa to be protected and wildlife thrives there, that if there was no reasonable economic value to be recovered from protecting that land, the land would be lost to wildlife because it would simply become land where domestic livestock would graze, where wild creatures would be displaced inevitably, where habitats would change, and in fact, where predators, particularly dangerous predators, and animals such as elephants, which maraud crops and kill people and so on and so forth, simply would not be tolerated. Now, let me add, I'm not trying to create a Pollyannic kind of view of all this. It is a complicated business that people have very, very strong opinions about. But the most important point to realize is that these strong opinions are not just between people who are, in quotation marks, opposed to hunting versus those who are in favor of it. We all know that the reality of the information available to us, the reality of the evidence, is that even within the hunting community, there are debates over the issue. So let's be honest and open, first of all, about this broad issue of trophy hunting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there has to be a lot of meaningful discussion that happens for sure.
Yeah, there does. And also when it comes to the issue of large carnivores, whether it is wolves or mountain lions or grizzly bears or black bears, or, that interjects another level of complexity.
For sure.
The human reaction, the human psyche, we have always been enthralled by the big carnivores, partly because they ate us, and we feared them, and also they taught us so much. After all, we had to learn to hunt from someone. Mm-hmm. Who did we learn to hunt from? We learned from them. And so we've had this extraordinary relationship with the big carnivores, and they are such amazing animals. And when we see them so independent, so capable, it's inevitable that we're going to have, when it comes to carnivores and the hunting of them, there is, and we know this, there is another layer of complexity introduced to the issue. A lot of people can say, oh, that person is a deer hunter. That man or woman, they get their deer every year. And, people say, well, they eat it and, that's a tradition and that's a pretty good thing. But once you get down and ask people, should we hunt wolves? I mean, look at the intense debates, not only here, but in Europe, over wolves. Mm-hmm. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. And in a way, it's also positive because we have this diversity of opinion about these big carnivores. But can we simply have these big carnivores everywhere? Can we have them constantly in our midst? Mm-hmm. Can we have them taking livestock? Can we have them doing damage? Can we have them attacking people? Can we, they're not innocent. They are big carnivores. They live by killing and eating. So in a modern society, trying to integrate our historic, our kind of psychological engagement with these great creatures that are part of our past, with the imagery of them as symbols of wilderness and the sheer beauty of these animals. I mean, wolves in the wild, bears are they're extraordinary creatures. I worked with black bears for decades, and some people say, why do you find bears so fascinating? I said, well, put it to you this way. Tell me another animal that you can teach to ride a bike. So when we look at trophy hunting, it had, in quotation marks, it freights this enormous complexity and extreme reaction. Yeah. And let me tell you, it's going to be there. That's it. Mm-hmm. Then when we introduce carnivores into the equation, it goes on steroids. But there are fundamental reasons for why the debate is as intense as it is. Society at large is going to have to make a decision about all of these issues, And it cannot be that we argue on the one hand that wildlife is the public's, owned by all the public, and then on the other hand, wish, whether we are hunters or anti-hunters, to squelch debate over the issue. when under law, we all own it.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to tackle for sure, but
It isn't not
no.
easy. And we need to be open about the fact that it is complex.
Yeah.
And we need to be open about, in many cases, there are no simple or easy answers. I have been in this business all my life. Animals have been the most important thing in my life since I can remember being alive. And anyone who tells me that they have the perfect solution for the conservation of wildlife, I just dismiss them instantly,
Right.
whether they hunt or whether they don't. And I'll tell you something else. In this world today, we better have every arrow in our quiver, from the most protectionist individual to the person who believes most strongly in the harvest of wildlife and other creatures. We better have every one of those arrows in our quiver if we expect to have any chance of keeping the wild others with us on this planet.
Well, Shane, we've eaten up quite a bit of your time here. I'm not sure if Amanda gave you a heads up, but we do like to include a hunting or just outdoor story with our guests. And we've had everything from bear attack stories to fishing stories and even a Sasquatch incident or something like that. So I don't know if you've got one ready for us, but if you do, please share it with us, and then we'll let you go.
Well, I guess if I came up with a sort of a fictitious one of a Newfoundland Sasquatch, that would probably go viral. But I don't have one on that. I haven't really thought a lot about this, but in emerging from our discussion here today, I have had a lot of experiences, both hunting and not hunting, with animals of many different kinds, from polar bears to caribou to weasels to hamsters. And a lot of them have been really profoundly affecting. But one I could share, I guess, with you that is not hunting, but it's related to this issue, I believe. I was fortunate for many years to spend the rutting season with woodland caribou for probably 20 years. I would also spend the calving seasons and winters, but the rutting seasons were especially spectacular for many, many reasons. I therefore was fortunate to witness many interactions between animals, male and female, and certainly witness some incredibly violent confrontations between males. Woodland caribou are, in our context in Newfoundland, are harem-forming animals. In other words, males gather large groups of females, and there's a dominance hierarchy established amongst the males. They don't breed on migration as the great tundra populations do, the migratory herds. They're also built differently, and the formation of their antlers are built in such a way that you can easily tell that instead of grappling with one another, they actually fight one another. So one of the more spectacular circumstances was a morning that I left my camp and I walked. I was often by myself. I walked. It was in mid to late October. The rut was in high gear. It was a morning when, the barren lands of Newfoundland had, all the little flashets or shallow ponds and the bogs, which are innumerable, that they'd all gathered this thin blue ice of early autumn onto themselves. The vegetation had all turned colors, of course, the siennas and the reds and the spectacular oranges and even blues were there in the leaves. And the caribou groups, of course, you could see them over long distances because the landscape was quite open with relatively little relief, although enough that a man could hide himself and move close to the animals. And I was looking along a kind of a shallow almost like a valley, but it was very, very shallow, and two small ridges that ran along the edges. And on each ridge, I suddenly saw coming out of this very heavy morning fog, which can be almost suffocating there in the early morning before it burns off. I saw these two groups of caribou emerging, and eventually could see that each of them had a number of males with them, but in both groups, there was obviously a significant harem master, this massive, big bull that was just absolutely spectacular. The black face and the bronzed antlers and the great capes, and the muscled necks and so on. And of course, fighting in these beasts is really predicated on equality. You don't really fight anyone unless they're really equal to you. And if you're not equal to them, you run away. And so real fights only occur between those that are matched. And I saw these two groups of animals suddenly see one another. And I eventually saw the two males do what they normally do, is they start to move out beyond the periphery of the females that they are watching over, and they perform their displays. They bush thrash, so they walk up to a small juniper and they rake its limbs with their antlers. And then they gather their hind legs together and pee on their hocks and rub them together and so on, so that they smell wonderfully, and they demonstrate, that I am powerful, I am strong, and you should really leave me alone and leave the females I'm with alone. And eventually, in this unbelievable theater of beauty, with these flashets frozen and the color emerging and the sun now beginning to burrow through and digest, consume this ground fog, these two big males suddenly began to approach. I knew there would be a significant fight. Now, I am only 30 to 40 meters, probably, about 40 meters away from these animals at the time. And they come together, and eventually, of course, they get close enough, and then what caribou do? They tip their heads, and they walk gently together until finally there is contact. And of course, when they connected, they exploded, right? And you had these two massive beasts turning and gouging and trying to do what caribou do in that circumstance, which is to break the neck of the opponent. It's not about pushing and pushing back so much as to entangle those antlers with all of those branches and tines, which caribou antlers are famous for, and twist the neck of the opponent. And I was watching this, of course, and the mud was flying, and they were slipping and falling and breaking through this shelf ice and all of this. And finally, I could see that there was one animal slowly gaining power over the second individual. And the trick for these animals then, in the midst of these intense conflicts, is to break cleanly and run. But as one animal tried to disengage and managed to do so, he slipped. And when he slipped, his opponent came at him broadside and charged into him, and I could hear the smacks. I could hear the bones breaking. You could feel this crushing sound of things that were happening inside the animal's body. And they kept doing this as this animal tried to disengage. And I watched this until finally he managed to break away. And suddenly, of course, bedlam ceases. Silence returns. The male that is victorious, he turns and very laboriously and slowly walks back to the females. The other group of females look at the defeated stag and begin to drift towards the other company. And then I see the male that was damaged, that had been broadsided repeatedly, collapse. And he died. Wow. He died. But what was most interesting was I eventually lost track of those animals, and I was following them. And I noticed the male, the big male that had won, he could not confront and deal with the stags around him any longer. He was too exhausted. And while I left them that day, I returned to find him dead. Both stags eventually died in pursuit of what they sought. And I recounted this story, I recall now, to a meeting a long time ago where the Sierra Club was present and where a lot of hunting organizations were not pleased. And the point of the story, I guess, in this context is, we can fight all we want over what we think is the prize. But in the end, it's about trying to preserve those experiences. Because not 1 in 50 million people, maybe not 1 in 100, 200, 400 million people, have ever experienced anything like I did that day. And I could never, ever have experienced anything like it if we had not found a way to work for wildlife 100 years ago. Because believe me, they would have all been gone. So it seems to me we're fighting over the wrong things. We ought to be fighting for them, not for our particular position about them.
That's a beautiful way to end this, Shane. I think you left both of us kind of speechless here. We're both in a trance here listening to that story, but I think that's
amazing. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah,
I loved them. And as I said, I was not hunting that day, just hunting to try to understand them.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's all I was looking for. And this was fed up to me as a gift. Had I been living in another time, I would have said the gods gave it to me.
Right.
But wildlife gave it to me. They gave it to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we see out there, and I think hunting is, for Mike and I anyways, we've seen a lot of things that we would never have seen. We've gone up and not quite as spectacular, but, we've got a bunch of great owls in the Okanagan region, and there's been a number of times where we go up to an elevation we never would have went to otherwise in November or whatever the time is, and you just see whether it's owls or other kind of animals that are
whitetail in the rut and all that kind of stuff. All these things that you'd otherwise miss, all these beautiful things that are taking place every single day.
Mm-hmm.
I think you would miss them otherwise unless you're out there to observe them, be it for hunting or for your own purposes. So
very true.
It's worth saving. So Shane, we appreciate all the work that you're doing, and as we've learned more over the last couple of years here, conservation is going to be something that we really start to focus more and more on with the podcast. So we definitely want to keep in touch with you, and anything we can do to help any of the work that you're doing, we'll gladly do that.
Well, I greatly appreciate that. Good luck to you both, and I hope you enjoy the wild meat that you have harvested.
We certainly will. Before we let you go, where can people find you if they want to get involved?
Well, I think if they search for me, they can find me pretty easily.
Perfect. We'll put up links as well. So,
yeah.
And your podcast is great. Love to see those episodes coming up. So, good work, and thank you again for your time, Shane.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye. There it is.
Yeah.
Shane Mahoney.
He's got a way with words.
Certainly does. I was kind of watching you as he's telling us that story, and I think both of us were just sort of in awe at what that is, and I think that's a great way to sum up why these things are worth preserving and protecting.
For sure.
So,
and I kind of think there's a secondary message there too. Is just nature isn't always rainbows and roses, right? And I mentioned this before, but going out and hunting and angling and seeing life in that way kind of gives you a new perspective on your own life.
Yeah, appreciation.
Yeah, and even just less, stress. Like you stress about certain things or worry about certain things, and once you kind of understand the bigger picture, that makes those things a little bit less stressful, or you know what I mean?
Yeah. For sure.
So
Less important.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It makes you feel small in a good way, though.
In a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Well, Cal, I don't really have much to add to this episode. I just feel fortunate to have had almost an hour and a half with with Shane to talk about this, and I hope everybody who listened gain something from that, and do make sure you check out his podcast and check out the website and everything like that. We'll put that on our website if anybody wants to find links. But yeah, like Shane said, if you search for him, you're gonna find him. So
Yep. And let us know what you think.
yeah, exactly. So anyways, I think let's call this an episode.
Yep. Thanks,
Happy
guys.
hunting, guys. Cheers.